This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to this edition of A Different Perspective. I am, in fact, Kevin Randle. And the big secret is I am just back from Roswell, New Mexico. I was down there for the festival. I was invited down there to give a couple of presentations, to participate in some panels, meet people, talk to them, and just share knowledge about UFOs, specifically the Roswell case. A lot of discussion about that naturally because we're in Roswell. I want to make a couple of comments about the museum since the last time I was down there. And in the museum, it has been upgraded quite a bit. It looks like a very professional museum now. It's got a lot of interesting displays. Some of them I don't agree with. There's a display of the sarcophagus lid from, I think, the Mayan culture that they say resembles astronauts in a spacecraft. I don't buy that. I think it's just a coincidence. His position makes it look like he's sitting in a spacecraft, that sort of thing. But there's an awful lot of interesting things. There's interactive displays down there. There's a display of the aliens on the gurney for taking the people out of Roswell. There's a big, huge Gort robot in the museum that does some stuff that's kind of interesting. Gort being the robot from The Day the Earth Stood Still. And so the museum has been upgraded. I disagree with some of the displays. There's a display about MJ-12 that doesn't suggest it's really the hoax that it is. I think they have overlooked some of the problems with it. And I talked to them about that. I know Don Schmidt has talked to them about that, and it still is up there without any kind of commentary suggesting that it's very controversial and probably not as accurate as it could be. As I said, I was down there to do some presentations, and I wanted to use sort of a Socratic method to give my presentations. I wanted to engage the audience in the discussion. I thought that it would be more interesting for everybody if we did something like that. True, I have a great knowledge of the Roswell case. I know quite a bit about the other UFO crashes. I labeled myself at the beginning of both of the presentations as the American expert on UFO crashes, and then gave props to Ryan Wood as the international expert on UFO crashes. But I wanted to not bring in, but have other people talk about their thoughts. It really didn't work. The only time that I was really engaged by anybody in the audience was a woman who was interested in the Aztec crash. This was from March of 1948, a year or so after the Roswell case. The original story came from two con men. Both were prosecuted for being involved in cons. There were a number of books. Behind the Flying Saucers, I think, came out in 1950. It was a bestseller, and it talked about the Aztec case. There was the UFO crash at Aztec by a guy named Steinman, which is, I'm not sure how to describe it, sort of lots of newspaper clippings, lots of other articles that relate to it, but not a lot of accurate information, I suppose I should say, information that suggests it was something there. And then, of course, Scott Ramsey's book, which I don't remember the name of, but he's done a lot of research into Aztec. He is convinced that it was something true, something authentic. She and I engaged in the dialogue, which is what I wanted to do, getting her perspective on what she thought about it. My perspective being it was a hoax, and I would ask her questions, and she would respond and kind of ask me questions. And this is what I wanted to do because it gave the audience two different perspectives in the same presentation. I mentioned a number of other cases. I just couldn't draw anybody out on any of them. They just were all sitting there. I think part of the problem is, given the location, the North Library down in Roswell, to make the screen visible, I had to turn off the lights. And of course, that put the audience in dark, but they could see what was on the screen for the slides. But that may have inhibited some of them talking. And I tried it another time on my second presentation there, and I had a fellow that was running the avionics, the video portion of it, and getting everything set up on the computer so we could flash the slides up on the screen. And he would come in and turn the lights on and turn the lights off for me periodically. And I thought, I'd give a little bit of the presentation and then we'd start asking questions and he'd turn the lights on. But there was only one guy that kind of engaged, and I think he only did it because I'd said something to him earlier about I wanted the people to engage. So it really didn't work out as well as it could have. So I think next year I won't be doing that. It just didn't work at all. We did a couple of panel discussions with Peter Robbins as the moderator. It was Don Schmidt, me, Frank Kimbler, and Dennis Baltheiser talking about the Roswell case. I'm not sure exactly why Frank Kimbler was on that. His part of the Roswell case is he's been out to the debris field looking for scraps of the debris. He had found some of the debris. And here's where we get into kind of the interesting part of it. There was a display in the museum part of this debris that he'd found that may or may not be alien. I suspect it is not, but they're not sure. There's testing going on. Tuesday, before the festival began, two people came in late in the day. They wandered around the museum. And when the area around where this display was empty, they pried it out of its fittings and ran out the door with it. Not really having thought this through, I don't know where they would have sold it had they stolen some real pieces of alien spacecraft, which would be invaluable, but they had a mock-up. And of course, they ignored the security camera. So there's very good pictures of them as they were leaving the museum. So they didn't get anything. And by the next day, Frank Kimbler had replaced that display with another mock-up. But the point is, it's a mock-up. I don't know what the thought process was in stealing it. So, but what I'm saying is, Frank has been out there. He's gathered bits of metallic debris. He's found some buttons that look like they came off old fatigue uniforms, which I'm not sure is relevant given that I remember the 1950s, and I really shouldn't say that. In the 1950s, I had a fatigue shirt, military fatigue shirt that came from a surplus store with the metallic buttons on it. It's no big deal. And I'm sure that the ranchers found those fatigue uniforms to be very sturdy and something that would be valuable for them to have. So I'm not sure about the relevance of the buttons, and we don't know when they were dropped. We have no clue about that. So he was on the panel. Dennis Baltheiser's been in Roswell for, I guess I can say decades now, kind of researching this thing. He and I got into a little dust up over, I think it may have been Aztec again, talking about that because I figured everybody pretty much believed Aztec be a hoax. But it was not really acrimonious. It was, here's our discussion about the Aztec case. Peter Robbins was Peter Robbins was the moderator. His questions became very convoluted. And he always came to me first because of the way we were sitting on the panel. He thought that, he's standing off to the left side. I'm at the left end of the panel. So he would ask his questions. Well, Kevin, what do you think? And I'm thinking, you don't have to come to me every time. So we went through that. The only problem with the panel discussion was that our presentations from I guess you could say the dais and Peter's questions ate up most of the time, and we had hoped there'd been about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour for questions from the audience, and it turned out to be somewhere around 30 minutes. Good questions from the audience and things that we wouldn't think of to explain, because to us it's all kind of second nature. We understand this case completely, and questions they would have about timing and sequences, we already know the answer to and don't think that they're important to talk about. So we did that. Also down there was Travis Walton, Yvonne Smith, and Tom Reed, all having with abductions. Travis Walton having been abducted. Spoke to him briefly. Didn't really have a chance to talk to Yvonne Smith and Tom Reed. It has a major display of his abduction and what the alien looked like in his abduction down there. And given the way everything was set up, didn't have really much of a chance to talk to them because we're always engaging people in front of the tables. And the way it was set up is a double line, and we had our backs to one another, so we didn't see everybody. So, but they talked about abductions, and I know there was an awful lot of people around Travis Walton quite a bit of the time. But the same thing can be said about Don Schmidt. There are a lot of people around them. And I would try to ambush people as they walk by, trying to interest them in my books, but and that went okay. I mean, it wasn't anything spectacular. Just talking to people about that. People would come up and ask questions. We try to answer them. Had a relatively good mix of people down there too, from young to old to everybody from various ethnic groups and racial identities. So we had a good mix down there. What was also going on, and I always feel a little bad about, is it's a festival. So they shut down parts of Main Street, and there's vendors there selling all kinds of food and other things like that. There was a parade and some contests like that. I didn't really see any of that because we were engaged in other things while that was going on and didn't have a chance to really participate in that. I think the first Saturday night, we didn't wrap everything up till nearly 9 o'clock, and then the parade had started and everything was blocked off. We had a hard time getting back to the hotel, but it worked out okay. Anyway, the festival was a good thing to have gone to. Got a chance to look at their library, which is becoming much more comprehensive. I think they've got practically every book ever published about UFOs. No, probably not. But they have some nice displays in there. They've got a complete set of the Project Blue Book files that are digitized for research purposes. So you can get in there, you can take a look at their materials, magazine articles, newspaper clippings, film, videotape, all that kind of stuff. And it's a very, very interesting library, a very nice library. So if you have research purposes, going to almost any aspect of UFOs, that would be the place you'd want to go because they have the details there in one location. I don't know of another place in the United States where there's this accumulation of UFO related material. There are other places that have displays and they have little museums and things like that, but I don't think it's nearly as comprehensive as what they have in Roswell. So all in all, it was well worth the effort to get down there and talk to people. I think that's the important point, is talking to people and convincing them that Project Mogul is not a viable answer, solution to what fell at Roswell. But the other thing that comes out of these discussions is everybody agrees something fell at Roswell. It's just a question of what it is. I think we've eliminated the terrestrial explanations, which takes us toward the extraterrestrial, but without some kind of smoking gun, I'm kind of worried about that. When I come back here in just a few seconds, I'm going to talk about some of the older cases that people think are not that interesting and we should be ignoring now for the new stuff. So I'll be back right after this, so please stick around. And as you can obviously see, I am back. I am without guests today. I'm flying solo. In the next few weeks, we'll have some interesting guests coming on the program to talk about things in the past. Now, to sort of contradict myself, saying that talking about the library that the museum down in Roswell has, there's another ongoing project, I guess I could call it, gathering hundreds of thousands of documents about UFOs up in Albuquerque, run by David Mahler. He's been on the program talking about this effort. And one of the things that he's doing there, of course, is gathering an awful lot of material that was published in the past. I think he's got all the IURs, the International UFO Reporters. I think he's got most of the UFO magazines that were published in the mid-1970s, and which I contributed to. I often say I paid my way through college on what I called my Saga scholarship. Saga was a men's magazine from the 1970s in this era. Not like Playboy, didn't have naked women in it or anything like that, but it was a magazine geared to the interests of men, and they would usually carry a UFO article. In the 73, 74 era, they began publishing the UFO Report, which was geared specifically to UFOs. And I would write an article for them practically once a semester, and it almost covered my tuition at the University of Iowa. So I say I went to college on my Saga scholarship. but it was these magazines were carrying an awful lot of material. Some of the magazines weren't very good, but he also has accessed newsletters put out by various UFO organizations, some that were pretty much localized in a specific area. Some of them were more international in scope, such as the APRA Bulletins, NICAP UFO Investigator, and now the MUFON Journal. But he was gathering all this, gathering case reports, gathering Project Blue Book materials. And you think about the Project Blue Book materials, they're available online, they're available at the National Archives, but the problem is those versions have been heavily redacted. What they've done is taken out all the names. What has been found is that Hynek had an awful lot of the case files without the name redacted, which were at the Center for UFO Studies, which is now being incorporated in this. I have an index that is not redacted. I mentioned before, I believe, that Bob Cornett, I had gone down to Maxwell Air Force Base back in the mid-1970s when the Project Blue Book files were first declassified, and they were stored at the Air Force Archives at Maxwell Air Force Base. Well, Bob Cornett and I were in Air Force ROTC, so we could get on the base easily. We had a letter from the commandant explaining who we were, and we went to the archives and asked to talk to him about the Project Blue Book files and learned that there was an index. And the first thing we did was we went through the index and we copied down all the names of the people who were involved in unidentified cases. We had the dates, we had the locations, we had the names. So when we got a hold of the files later on, as they became public and the names were redacted, we could put it all back together. In fact, I've done a couple of books, Project Blue Book Exposed and the Best of Project Blue Book, and in that is the 701 cases that the Air Force had been unable to identify, with the names put back in. Some of them are just civilian military, and we didn't have those names. Although I found that if you go through the case files, and if they're very extensive cases, they've always missed names. I've rarely been into a case file, unless it was very, very small, just 4 or 5 pages, where somebody didn't miss a name or two, so you could plug the names back in. I have published the unidentifieds in both those books for those who are interested in doing that. And I also have a copy of the complete index with the names unredacted. So some of my research has paid off. But the real point is here we've got 2 sources, both of them in New Mexico, as a matter of fact, with libraries. The operation really completed yet. They're scanning with all kinds. He's got like 7 scanners and all this other equipment, so we can digitize files, the video files, the film files, the audio files, and all this stuff, and making a much more comprehensive library of UFO material, which I think is a good thing. Which leads me to the point is I have heard, and in my discussions in Roswell, as a matter of fact, people were wondering what's the point of looking at these old cases. And the answer is simply that an awful lot of the times the old cases weren't properly investigated. The prime example, and I think I've mentioned this, is a case from, it's labeled, I believe, March 29th, 1952 from Baltimore, Maryland. And the Air Force wrote it off as a hoax. And it's got 2 people who are involved in this case where their car was stalled and they saw the UFO close at hand and that sort of thing. And the Air Force investigated, first believing the case took place on April 14th of 1952, learning that really it was March 29th, 1952, and that's the case they did. And they went out and interviewed witnesses who lived in the area, who worked in the area. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? And they got no answer. Turns out the case is really from March 14th of 1952. And going through the case, of course, I was able to find out the names of the people and figure out who they were based on the Air Force file. But Barry Greenwood sent me a couple of newspaper clippings from March 15th, making it the case from the 14th. Pointed out 2 other witnesses who were there and saw the same thing, who were involved in this. The Air Force somehow missed that. My point being simply that the Project Blue Book files, a lot of times they didn't investigate with as much enthusiasm as you would expect them to have. They weren't really looking for answers so much as coloring in the blocks. In 1952, they were doing quite a lot of investigation, but they were overwhelmed by the number of UFO cases that had come in, especially in July of 1952. But they didn't do a real good. And the upshot of all that was in January of 1953, the CIA sponsored the Robertson panel, which wrote everything off as hoaxes and misidentifications and people being uneducated, not knowing what they're looking at and that sort of thing. And school teachers should not allow students to write book reports on UFO books, and they should not use UFOs as a topic for any kind of rhetoric classes they may have been taking, in a way to suppress the information, I guess is the best way of putting it. And from that point on, it really became, Project Blue Book became more of a public relations outfit than anything else. The point simply is there are very important cases that took place in that era that even now today's environment, we're really not looking at that much. We're kind of ignoring. I think specifically, I think the number 2 case in the UFO field is probably Level Land. And I've talked about that quite a bit. I think it's an important case because of the number of witnesses, the interaction with the environment, the landing traces that were left behind, and the Air Force attitude in the investigation. This was from November of 1957. Level Land being 15 minutes from Lubbock, something like that. So it's in West Texas. Level Land is just west of Lubbock. I've been to Level Land a couple of times, talked to people down there, as has, I think, Don Berliner did, Don Burlinson did, looked at that case. The sheriff went out and looked for the UFO. If you read the newspaper articles that were published prior to the Air Force investigation, he's talking about having seen a oval-shaped object, a bright red object. Don Berliner talked to the mechanic for the sheriff's department, who said that the day after this, the sheriff brought his car in to be examined. And the only reason he would have done that is if his car had stalled, to find out there was some kind of mechanical reason for that car stalling other than the close approach of the UFO. And that leads us to the Texas Department of Public Safety, which was following the sheriff, and to the United States Air Force, which was following the Texas Department of Public Safety. So they all got close enough for their cars to be stalled. But the point simply is, cars were stalled. There's evidence of landing traces in the area, that sort of thing. Once the Air Force investigator showed up and spent all of 7 hours, I think, in Level Land investigating the case, I think spent most of the time at Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock. He wrote the case off as ball lightning, ridiculous. Like I said, I've said this before. I've done a book on Level Land. It examines all of this in depth, presents the evidence, and shows that here is an important case that rivals Roswell simply because you have all these various chains of evidence. You have the eyewitness testimony, you have the interaction with the environment, you have the landing trace cases, you have the sheriff's had hundreds of witnesses, got hundreds of phone calls about this thing coming in, and there's dozens of people who talked about cars being stalled, got the close approach of the UFO. The interesting thing is it kind of led to a misnomer, and that was when the UFO left, the car started. Well, if you read the reports from the people, they really don't say that for the most part. What they usually say is once the UFO's gone, the car could be started. They implied that they took some action to start the car. It wasn't the removal of the electromagnetic effect that allowed the car to spontaneous start. The drivers had to take some action, with a single exception that I know of that said his car started spontaneously. The point being, when the Condon Committee, the University of Colorado study was in force, and they rarely mention Level Land, but what they point out is that the scientists could think of no mechanism that you remove a electromagnetic field, which can suppress the electrical circuits, there's no question about that, would allow the car to start spontaneously. And as I look through literally hundreds of cases, not just Level Land, but from around the world and long past the Level Land case, it became clear to me that the cars, for the most part, were not starting spontaneously. The driver took some action to start the cars. There were other side effects of these electromagnetic effects. I think there's 4 cases where the car changed colors, which is kind of funny. One of the cases, the guy went home and his wife wanted to know if he'd bought a new car because the car was a different color. So I think, these sorts of cases are important for us to study because there's a lot that we can learn today, even long after the fact. I mean, we're doing historical study now as opposed to on-site investigations and that sort of thing, but we're doing these sorts of things now, and we're gaining information, and we're learning where the mistakes were made, and we're getting information that suggests something other than misidentifications and hoaxes and hallucinations and hysteria are causing all this. And I think Levelland is one of the prime examples of that. I could also talk about the Washington National sightings from July of 1952. And these took place on 2 consecutive Saturday nights in Washington, D.C. Washington National Airport was the airport where the radar room was set up, and there were people there to do that. But they were tracking objects on the radar scopes. Airline pilots were seeing the objects. The radar operators were contacting the commercial pilots, telling them, there's an object or something off to your right or your left, and the pilot would report, there's something there. And this went on for hours. There were multiple radars involved, not only at Washington National Airport. There was radars at 2 other locations that were picking up the objects, oftentimes in the same location, suggesting something more ominous than the Air Force explanation of anomalous propagation, which is a fancy way of saying temperature inversions were causing the objects to be seen on radar. Now, I talked to 2 of the people who were in the radar room in the second night of the sightings in late July of 1952. Both of them, Al Chop, who was the Air Force, the Pentagon's public relations expert on UFOs, and Dewey Fournay, who was the liaison between the Pentagon and the UFO investigation in Dayton, Ohio, Project Blue Book. Both of them were there on the second night. They were watching what was going on the radar scopes and that sort of thing. I will come back to that point in just a minute, because I think it was something that needs to be fleshed out, because I've talked to the witnesses who were there. And when we come back, we'll take a look at some of the things that about the current state of UFOs and some additional cases and things like that. So while I'm thinking of it, take a look at some of my books. They're available at Amazon.com, and I will be back right after this. And I am back once again, as you obviously can see. One of the things I don't do very well is promote my own work. I have an opportunity here to promote a number of the books, and I simply forget to do that. When we went away, I was talking about 2 of the books I'd done, or talking about the Washington Nationals, I guess. And I did a book called Cleverly the Washington Nationals, and it gives you detailed descriptions of what was going on in 1952, not only just the Washington National sightings, but what led up to that and what some of the outcome of that was. And as I was talking about, I had an opportunity to speak to Dewey Fournay, Major Dewey Fournay, and Al Chop. And one of them told me, he said there's one sighting that got pretty gory. The Air Force had been scrambled. They brought jet fighters in trying to intercept these objects that were being reported, both seen on the radar scopes and in the sky. And one of them said, and I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was Dewey Fournay who told me one of them got very gory. When I talked to Al Chop, I pulled the old trick any investigator would do, any reporter would do. You see, I was talking to the other guy, and he was talking about this sighting that got very, very gory, suggesting that I already knew about it, which I didn't. But then the other one told me the details, which was a fighter being intercepted, and what was going on as the objects seemed to surround that fighter plane. But it was interesting sightings because of multiple radars involved, multiple pilots involved, multiple crews, and I say at both the Air Force Base and at the airports, civilian airports. There were fighters involved. There was interviews with some of the fighter pilots and what they had done. So it becomes a complex case. There's no good photograph that I know of, but this the interest in the UFOs then kind of slowed down. The one thing that has always cracked me up is there's a wonderful headline in the Cedar Rapids, Iowa Gazette from July of 1952. It's a headline right out of science fiction: "Saucers swarm over Capitol." I'm thinking, if they're going to make a movie about flying saucers, that would be the headline I would use. Anyway, it, I think, spurred the Air Force into a press conference they held about the same time. One of the points was Ed Ruppelt, who was the man in charge of Project Blue Book at the time, happened to be in Washington, D.C. on the Monday after, I think, the first Saturday night of sightings. And he learned about this in the newspapers, and he said, well, I've got to stay. I can't go back. He was there to brief somebody in the Pentagon or something like that. And he called back to Dayton, and they said, no, your orders say you have to come home today. If you don't, you're going to be considered AWOL. I mean, the guy charged with the investigation of the UFOs is told, you must return to your home station. We can't amend your orders. We're not going to do any of that. You just come back, which is kind of a silly way to do these sorts of things. But the Air Force had a big press conference, and it was the largest press conference they had held since the end of the Second World War. And in the Washington National Book, the press conference, I've got the whole transcript of the press conference. And it was there that this temperature inversion explanation seemed to rear its ugly head for the first time, and they glommed onto that. It's got to be that temperature inversions. All these people were mistaking the glowing lights and the maneuvering of the craft and the radar returns. It was all due to temperature inversion. Temperature inversion is a layer of cold air above a layer of warm air, so you get a refraction of stuff when you're looking through that. It's kind of like you stick a pencil in a glass of water and it looks like the pencil is bent. It's kind of the same sort of thing. So temperature inversions can bend radar waves so that they bounce off objects on the ground and give you the impression in the sky. But the temperature inversions over Washington at the time were very weak. I don't think they were persistent, and the objects being seen seemed to react to the presence of the fighters, seemed to pace the civilian aircraft. There are people on the ground who saw it. And you can see in the Project Blue Book files where some of the military witnesses were sort of intimidated by what they had reported, and their reports change over time to more or less reflect the Air Force opinion of what they were. One of the other sightings that is very exciting that we need to look at was Socorro, New Mexico in 1964, April 24th, 1964. And it's important because you've got a craft on the ground. It leaves impressions on the ground. You've got a police officer witness to two beings outside the craft. And it's one of, I think, only 3 cases where beings were reported by the witness and the Air Force didn't write it off as a psychological problem. In fact, Hector Quintanilla, who was the man in charge of Project Blue Book at that time, who had top secret clearances, he went down to New Mexico to see if he could find any research project that might explain that, and couldn't find anything, which I think is an important point. And his conclusion was it was unidentified. He didn't know what it was. He thought the answer was in Lonnie Zamora's head, something he had seen, something he had done, would tell him exactly what had happened, but he didn't know what it was. So it's unidentified. What's important about the case is, again, we see how the Air Force investigated. J. Allen Hynek, the Air Force consultant to Project Blue Book, was sent to New Mexico to gather information. Got there a couple of days later. Got there before the impressions in the ground had been destroyed, I guess is the best way to say it. Did his investigation. There was another case in La Madera, New Mexico, the night after the Zamora sighting, where it was another landing and that sort of thing, some kind of traces left behind. Hynek requested permission to stay in Socorro, New Mexico, long enough so that he could travel up to La Madera. It's north of Albuquerque, maybe a little bit north of Santa Fe. It's in that area, to interview the witnesses there. And the Air Force says, no, you're there to do a Socorro, come home. Another case where I think additional investigation would have helped. I, for the longest time, said that Socorro was single witness, Lonnie Zamora being the only person who had seen anything. Turns out, and I've mentioned this before, and if you go back to the archives of this program, you can listen to Ben Moss and Tony Angelo talking about this. And they said, well, there were 3 people who had called before Zamora made his report of seeing something on the ground, about something in the sky, a loud roar in the sky. And I quizzed him at the time about, did you look at the police records? And they never really gave me an answer to that. And of course, the problem is there was nothing in the police records. But looking at the case file in the Project Blue Book files, there's a short half-page report by Captain Richard Holder, who was assigned to White Sands Missile Range, but his station was closer to Socorro than it was to Alamogordo. So he lived in the Socorro area. Within 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours, he and a FBI agent were talking to Zamora. And he put in his report that 3 people had called into the police station. So we have documentation from that night of additional witnesses. Nobody ever followed up on that. I don't get that. But here's an important case. We can learn still more about these cases by going back and looking what was published and looking what was said and gathering the additional information from the witnesses who were still alive, people who were there and remember that sort of thing, which kind of brings us to Pascagoula. And this is the abduction of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Once again, Calvin Parker has been on this program a couple of times, talking about their experiences. It's an important case because it's multiple witnesses, 2 guys abducted together, taken into the craft and examined. Parker was very reticent to talk about it, and Hickson said, well, tell him you passed out and you don't remember anything, which is what he did for literally years and years and years. But in my discussion with Calvin Parker, he mentioned additional witnesses had been found. There were additional witnesses to the sighting, all of them coming forward after the turn of the century, which was somewhat problematic. But he said, no, other witnesses that came forward right afterward. In the course of the investigation, Hickson and Parker were taken to Keesler Air Force Base, which is not that far from Keesler, or from Pascagoula. And they were going to check for some kind of radiation. I don't know exactly how they were going to do that. But in the course of that, they were interviewed by some of the top brass at Keesler Air Force Base. And there's a document and list of names who were there. And in the course of that investigation, the name surfaces of other people who had seen the UFO that night. There's 4 additional witnesses who were talked to the day after Hickson and Parker made their report. And I think that's extremely extraordinary because they can talk about what they had seen, and it kind of corroborates what Hickson and Parker said. The other important point is that Hickson and Parker went to the sheriff's office. They were left alone in a room, not knowing there was a recording being made. And had they been making a hoax, the idea is that they would have been discussing some of that amongst them or between themselves, with the sheriff's deputies and the sheriff all missing out of it. So they got a recording of what they discussed, and they didn't talk about that. They talked about the horror of what they had just been through, which is a important point. And here's the next important point. We go back to David Marler up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He just recovered the APRO file on the Hickson Parker abduction. And there's additional information in there. There's additional audio, maybe a film of Hickson Parker in the days right after the abduction took place. So we've got evidence that hasn't seen the light of day, again, literally for decades. Yeah, the APRO files went into hiding in, I think it was 1985, after the passing of Carl Lorenzen. Jim had already died, and once that happened, the children of the Lorenzens, of course, inherited the files, and they took them and stored them elsewhere. And for literally, again, decades, people have been trying to find it. At one point, they wanted $25,000 for access to the files. And at that time, nobody could raise the $25,000. I think in today's environment, there's a number of people in the UFO field who have contributed to the acquisition of the files, which became unnecessary because David Mahler, in his communications with the Lorenzen children, actually got access to the files. And by going through that, he found the APRO file on the Hickson Parker abduction and discovered this important evidence. And so we have a case where somebody is talking about being abducted, but it's not just recovered memories through hypnosis. It's memories of what went on without the use of hypnosis. The interviews taking place the day after, actually that very evening for the first part, and then the day after or 2 days after, when Hynek and Jim Harder showed up to conduct the investigation as well. The gathering of additional witnesses and military documents to kind of support the idea that these guys were abducted. Now, it doesn't say, yeah, they were abducted by alien creatures, but it's a document explaining what they had been talking about. So it becomes a very important case, and it shows that when we look at these older cases, we find information that is pertinent, that information that is important. So we have to not just push all that aside, but we have to go back and look at that information in a different context. We gather additional information, we gather additional witnesses, we can reconstruct some of this. Now, 1973, of course, both Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson have passed away, but there are other witnesses who have not passed away. Philip Mantle and Irene Scott have been doing a wonderful job of gathering some of that information and bringing it forward, and have done a number of books. I did a book called Encounter in the Desert. I'm sorry, that's about Socorro. I did a book called 1973, which deals with what was going on in 1973 with the emphasis on the Hickson Parker abduction. You can find that on Amazon as well. I will be back right after this, so please stick around. And once again, I have returned for the last. The other segments have gone a little longer than I planned. I wanted to talk about some of the current things going on in the UFO field, which I think are somewhat disgusting. I have been, again, threatened with a lawsuit. Don Ecker, we talked about Don Ecker being threatened with a lawsuit. There's this ongoing infighting in the field, which too often I think gets in the way of our investigations, not just the influence or the hindrance by the government or hiding of information, but the way we conduct ourselves is, I think, often inappropriate. I try not to say things about other researchers with whom I disagree. I guess one of the best examples is Philip Klass. I mean, we clashed a number of times, especially about the Roswell case, but other things. When we were talking about UFOs, there was acrimony between us. When we talked about other things outside the arena of UFOs, well, it was not acrimonious. We get along quite well. In fact, I've been sailing one time in my life, and it was on the Potomac River, and it was on Phil Klass's sailboat. I was astonished that he got stuck in the mud in the middle of the Potomac, and he would not use his emergency power engine to get it off. He wanted to do it by maneuvering with the sails, and he was successful at doing it. So he was quite the accomplished sailor. Last time I saw him was in, I think, 2000 at the MUFON convention in St. Louis, and he was very, very frail. I was going to say feeble, but frail is the better word. He asked me to assist him up to his room because he couldn't get up the steps. He had trouble going up the steps. So, of course, I did. It was not that big a deal. But I think that there too often is this idea, and we find it in politics today too. You're wrong, I'm right. I don't want to listen to anything you have to say. There's nothing you can tell me that's going to convince me that I'm wrong on any point. And I think that too often invades the thinking in UFOs. I think Philip Klass's attitude may have been there is no alien visitation, ergo anything that suggests otherwise has got to be wrong and most likely a hoax. And he did cause trouble for people in the UFO field periodically by his insistence on talking to their bosses and suggesting they believed in UFOs and things like that. I was at a conference in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he called the sponsoring agencies, and I think it was at the University of Nebraska, about the nature of the conference and that we were all a bunch of commie sympathizers because we were arguing against the U.S. government. The U.S. government has told us what's going on. We were arguing against it. We were bad people for doing that. To their credit, they did not cancel the conference. So we went on and did that. So we end up with that kind of thing between the debunkers and the true believers, more so than between those of us who lean toward the extraterrestrial and the skeptics, who I think we have a better communication. We're willing to look to the other side. What does the other side have to say? Is the information they are presenting, is something we need to start talk about? I think one of the best points of that is on cattle mutilations, and I was discussing cattle mutilations with someone from the point of view that I think it's all terrestrially based. I don't think there's an alien component to it. And he, of course, believes the alien component. And he said to me, well, what about the deficiency of copper in the blood of the slaughtered animals, the cows? And I thought, well, that's a very good question. Fortunately, we have the internet. And I was able to Google the copper deficiency in cattle and discovered that that's a big thing, that there are places in the United States where copper supplements are given to the cattle in their feed because they have a deficiency in copper. If a cow has given birth, that cow has a deficiency of copper in the blood. So there are terrestrial explanations. It's not something that is mysterious that only happens if there's some kind of mutilation associated with it. And I think that's the important point. He's asked a question, well, how do you explain it? And I thought, good question, I'll explain it. And I was able to find a number of journal articles and other information about copper deficiency in cattle, which you all can do as well. But there's an awful lot of infighting over turf as well. How dare you encroach upon the siting that I'm investigating? And I ran into that, and I say I ran into it. Don Schmidt and I ran into that when we began our Roswell investigation, that there were those who had preceded us and thought we were encroaching on their turf, and yet they had done nothing with the Roswell investigation for years. So we began our investigation. Kufos actually communicated with Stan Friedman, and he said, yes, there's stuff to be learned. There's stuff that needs to be done. So he kind of applauded our beginning and later on became something of an adversary in that, which was unfortunate. We were supposed to share information, and Don and I tried to share information with him, but we got very little back from him. And he kind of diverted the conversation from the Roswell case, but over to the plains of San Augustine. And if you are interested in that controversy, I cover it in Roswell in the 21st Century, I think, at length. So you can see how we ended up with this idea there might have been something over on the plains. I am convinced there was nothing there in 1947. There may have been something there much later, but there was nothing in 1947 that would relate to the Roswell case. But we have an awful lot of that infighting. I know that the main organizations, this was mostly true in the 1980s when NAPRO and NICAP and MUFON were all viable organizations. NICAP and APRO are gone, and I think APRO disappeared because the Lorenzens, the spark behind it, had passed away. NICAP got into their own infighting about who was in charge and who was doing this and who was doing that, and they kind of collapsed in an outgrowth of that infighting amongst themselves. But the point is, those organizations also had sort of an adversarial relationship. Periodically, you would see some sort of attempted cooperation. I know in the late 20th century, the Fund for UFO Research, QFOs, and MUFON got together in an attempt to research some of the Roswell stuff, especially things from over on the plains of San Augustine, that culminated in a meeting in Chicago in the early 1990s and a publication that outlined, Stan outlined his point of view, I outlined our point of view, Mike Swords, who was sort of the moderator, outlined his point of view, and then we each got an opportunity to rebut the other claims. So I got to rebut what Stan had said, and Stan got to rebut what I had said. I worked in conjunction with Don Schmidt and Tom Carey on our part, so it wasn't just my effort. I was the one that actually typed everything up and kind of set the tone and the outline, but both Don and Tom contributed to that. And that worked out very well. One of the things that we were talking about was this guy, Gerald Anderson, who had come forward and said he had been on the plains of San Augustine. He'd seen the archaeologists and the craft that had crashed, and he had seen the bodies. And gave us the name of the archaeologist so we could find it. A guy named, he said his name was Adrian Buskirk. Tom Carey, who had all but his dissertation done in anthropology, I think he was in physical anthropology, went to the library at University of Pennsylvania, because supposedly these are where the guys came from, and got into the card catalog, and he said almost the first card he put his hand on was a guy named Winifred Buskirk, who had been anthropologist and had done anthropological research about the Western Apache at the time. So he was in New Mexico. So Anderson kind of identified the archaeologist, but when we got a hold of Buskirk, he couldn't figure it out because he'd seen nothing like that. He said there was nothing like that. We later learned that Buskirk taught a class in anthropology at the Albuquerque High School, and Anderson didn't take the class. That's where that connection came about. So to us, and that's Don and me and most of QFOS and a number of other people, believed that the plains of San Augustine crash, if it took place, didn't take place in 1947. Barney Barnett would be the lone witness. Everything else goes back to him. They heard the story from him. Anderson heard the story off Unsolved Mysteries and other places, so he was badly contaminated, and we were able to eliminate him from the tail because of all that. So that infighting sort of it hampers our research, which kind of takes me, and I've got to do it quickly now, to where are we going to go today? We look to the past for the prelude, I guess you could say, the good cases there that leads us to the point of view that something physical is going on, something is happening here. We need to look at it. And yeah, a lot of it can be explained in terrestrial terms, but there are some interesting cases that simply cannot. Even with the amount of information available in those cases, we still cannot come to a terrestrial explanation. Doesn't get us exactly to the extraterrestrial, but it leads us in that direction. But what we talk about today quite a bit is disclosure. And I was excited about disclosure in 2017 when Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal published their first articles and talked about the Navy and what was going on and the Nimitz, and the videos came out and looked like government agencies were becoming more transparent in their investigation of UFOs or what they had seen in the past. Here we are, 7 years later, nothing has changed. We've gotten information about various investigations the government's going to conduct. We're told how they're going to conduct the investigations. We're told who's going to conduct the investigations. We get very little on what the investigation turned up, if anything. We see a couple of videos here and there, and we get the conclusions. Well, we found nothing to suggest any alien visitation, or as I like to say, off-world visitation. Nothing to suggest we can go in that direction. No physical evidence. The reports, especially those that are confirmed by instrumentality, the ships, maybe glitches in the instrumentation. There was one fellow, there was a video up on YouTube where he had taped night vision goggles to his cell phone, and he actually got an image that looked an awful lot like one of the videos that had been released. So we can say, well, maybe it is kind of a glitch in the equipment, in the instrument. Sometimes it's not that. Oftentimes there's just something we cannot explain. So I fear that disclosure is going to erode to the point that it has been for the last 50 years. They're not going to disclose anything. There's no motivation for them to disclose anything. They've talked about it and talked about it. Now we're off onto another election cycle that is becoming quite divisive. And so that's UFOs, which have been around now, we can say, for 75, 80 years, depending on when you want to set the modern date as. And nothing has happened. We gained no benefits from them. They haven't attacked. Invasion fleet has not shown up. If people are injured by close approaches to this phenomenon, it's usually something that is not planned. It's inconsequential. They got too close to something and were burned, for example, by the heat of the object or something like that. It wasn't intentional, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, I don't think disclosure is anywhere coming down in our future. In the future, I will be discussing David Jones's work on the Ramey Memo, which he has a different take on it, which will be quite interesting. And we'll be talking to some other people who have inside knowledge. If you want more information about a lot of this, take a look at my blog at kevinrandle.blogspot.com. There's like 1,500 articles on there that go back to 2007. Go to amazon.com, look up my books. I think there's something for everybody. And just to say something fun, I had a book published in Russian. Yeah, I can only read my name. Anyway, that's it for this week. Thank you for dropping by.